hot take: in the next 20 years, classical theism will go the way of Young Earth Creationism. These days, the sophisticated apologists like William Lane Craig, who has, I think, two PhDs, one in philosophy and one in theology, and Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, who I think has a master's degree and is scoping out the possibility of doing a PhD. These apologists are not apologizing for young earth creationism. Why is this? In my view, because it cannot be defended. Until recently, William Lane Craig held to an historical Adam and an historical Eve, but his position has shifted somewhat. Jerry Coyne was highlighting a video of Dr. William Lane Craig in which he says, "I believe in the historical Adam and the historical Eve. However, if I was forced by the evidence to budge from my position, I would say that the genre of the book of Genesis is not meant to be historical but myth. However, this myth contains historical elements." And so William Lane Craig has shifted to that position. He calls the book, the first few chapters of Genesis, mytho-history. And I think that the term mytho-history was only invented in the last 60 years. I think it was invented in the 1960s. And so it would be difficult to make a case that the Christian Church always interpreted the book of Genesis as mytho-history if this term was only invented in the 1960s. If the Bible teaches anything explicitly and consistently, in my view, then it teaches that the earth was created directly and especially by God in the recent past, thousands of years ago, not billions of years ago. However, apologists like Dr. William Lane Craig and Inspiring Philosophy, they know that they cannot defend this, and so they've abandoned it. And Inspiring Philosophy was talking to Matt Fradd, and he discusses how he changed his mind on this topic, and he said that it wasn't exegeting scripture that made him change his mind on this topic, but reading why evolution is true by Jerry Coyne. So it's not through exegeting the Bible that Michael Jones changed his mind on this issue, but by reading a science book written by an atheist, and the foreword is actually written by Richard Dawkins. So that is how Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy came to the view that evolution is true, not through the Bible, but by a modern science book written by an atheist. And then what he did is he went back to the Bible and tried to eisegete what Jerry Coyne expounded scientifically into the text. He's trying to ram modern science into an ancient work of superstition and mythology, because that's what the book of Genesis is. So the reason why apologists like William Lane Craig and Michael Jones, the sophisticated apologists, the allegedly reasonable apologists, the allegedly scholarly apologists, the reason why they don't defend Young Earth Creationism is because they can't. And they know that they can't. They know that this is a lost battle. Indeed, Pothola, who is an atheist who debunks Young Earth Creationism, he has the Golden Crocoduck Awards, and the Golden Crocoduck statue has inscribed upon it the Latin phrase semper bardus, which means always stupid. And it is the Golden Crocoduck Award happens on the feast of St. Jude. St. Jude is the patron saint of lost causes. So the well-educated, sophisticated apologist, he knows that Young Earth Creationism cannot be defended. It's a lost cause, and so they don't. Even though the Bible clearly teaches that the earth was created thousands of years ago. St. Luke traces Jesus' biology all the way back to Adam. He doesn't trace it all the way back to Homo heidelbergensis. William Lane Craig, daftly in my view, thinks that Adam and Eve were Homo heidelbergensis, who lived about 100,000 years ago. St. Luke does not trace it back that far. He traces it back a few thousand years. In the Ten Commandments, Yahweh says that he created the heavens and the earth in 7 days. So if the Bible teaches anything clearly, it teaches that the earth was created thousands of years ago, but the apologists can't defend it, so they try to ram in billions of years and modern science into the Bible, which in my view is a fool's errand. And Robert Green Ingersoll condemns it. The pastor who accepts evolution is, in Ingersoll's view, diluting the scriptures, and the scientist who tries to make the book of Genesis conform and cohere with modern science, he is betraying and diluting science. Science has absolutely nothing to do with the superstitious creation myth in the book of Genesis. Nothing at all. However, the likes of William Lane Craig and Michael Jones will try to con you into thinking otherwise. And so even though the Bible clearly teaches that the earth was created thousands of years ago in the recent past, the sophisticated apologist does not defend this. Another sophisticated apologist is Andy Stanley. He doesn't defend Young Earth Creationism because he cannot. Andy Stanley is desperately trying to reinvent Christianity. He's thrown overboard the creation of the earth in the recent past. He's thrown over scriptural inerrancy. He has thrown overboard the goodness of the Old Testament. However, the more items of the sinking ship that he throws overboard, the less seaworthy the bark of Peter becomes. The more things, the more essential items that Andy Stanley throws overboard, the less reason Christianity has to exist. The raison d'etre, the reason for being of Christianity is, as St. Paul says, because Adam, an historical person who lived in the recent past, sinned. He brought sin into the world. The wages of sin is death. Death is a punishment for sin. And then, a few thousand years later, Jesus Christ conquered sin and death. And so, if you throw overboard Young Earth Creationism, then Jesus has nothing to do. If death was in the world before sin for millions and billions of years, then death is not a punishment for sin. Jesus has nothing to do. Jesus is unemployed, as one atheist put it. And so, what I would like to predict is that in 20 years' time, classical theism will go the way of Young Earth Creationism, in the sense that the sophisticated apologists will no longer defend it. And indeed, just like Michael Jones does with Young Earth Creationism, they will rewrite history and say that, oh well, true Christianity never taught that there was a classical theistic God. And so in 20 years' time, the Michael Joneses of this world will be rewriting history and making YouTube videos saying that true Christianity never taught classical theism. And he'll find quotes. He'll find quotes in the Bible. He'll find quotes in the Church Fathers for this. I was watching Professor MTH. He was an old school atheist channel, and he had an excellent video on bullshit. And bullshit, some philosopher wrote a PhD, and the title of it was On Bullshit. And this philosopher defined bullshit as using whatever comes to hand so as to prove a point. The truth or accuracy of the information is secondary. I don't believe that inspiring philosophy is consciously lying. I just think that inspiring philosophy is, Michael Jones is simply looking for whatever comes to hand to prove his point. And that's what bullshit is. Michael Jones is a bullshitter. And I don't mean to be rude. I mean nothing personal in this. Indeed, I wish that the phenomenon of bullshit was not called this, because I don't like swearing or vulgar words, but unfortunately, because the word bullshit comes from America, Americans are a little cruder than we Europeans. But you know, the term, I would have chosen a different term for this, but the term is there. A bullshit artist uses whatever comes to hand to prove a point, and this is what Michael Jones does. If Michael Jones abandoned classical theism, which he might do in the next 20 years, then what he'll do is he'll go to those PhD, he'll ransack PhD literature, he'll ransack the Bible, he'll ransack the church fathers, and you find verses and writings that indeed it will show that it will be buttressing to his point that the Christian church really never taught classical theism. He will find in Isaiah where it says, I, the Lord, create evil. So one of the attributes of a classically theistic God is that he is all good. Indeed, he is maximally good. He is the best being that a human being can imagine, and he is even better than that, because human imagination is finite, whereas divine goodness is infinite. So God is better than we could even possibly imagine. But in 20 years' time, some apologists will point to Isaiah and say, well, see, God here is saying that I'm not a classically theistic God because I create evil. So I don't think that classical theism can be honestly defended. However, apologetics hasn't caught up with this fact yet, in the same way that apologetics has caught up with the notion that Young Earth Creationism cannot be defended. But if there is a God, he is not all good, because there is so much horrendous suffering in the world. And I advise that you read John Loftus's God and Horrendous Suffering. In my view, it's irrefutable that if a God exists, he's not all good, and it only takes one of these attributes to fail for classical theism to fail. I always like to point out Abba Fan, and I always like to point people to Abba Fan. Abba Fan was a village in Wales, and the children were in the schoolhouse, and according to the Crown, they were even at the time of the coal avalanche, they were singing hymns to God. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it makes a good story. And so in the Crown episode, Abba Fan, these children are singing hymns to God, and then an avalanche of coal buries them alive, and they didn't all die immediately, because I think one or two of them were pulled out alive. So imagine coal running down a mountainside, hitting a school and burying children alive, and there is a child in that coal, and he or she is terrified, alone, in pain, and slowly bleeding out, dying. And as one of the news announcers at the time pointed out, if that avalanche had happened a few hours earlier, there would have been far fewer casualties. If that avalanche had happened a few hours earlier, then those school children would have still been at home. They wouldn't have been in the school. And so what I like to say is, imagine a person, a human being, a person, because the Christian God is personal. So the Christian God is more than a human being, but he is not less than a human being. And also the Christian God is a human being because Jesus is a human being. So imagine, with the eye of the imagination, God as a person, and he's standing in Abba Fan, and it is a few hours before the avalanche, and what does this God do? Does he run into all the houses and say, hey, evacuate this village, a catastrophic avalanche is coming. No, this God just stands there and waits and looks on as, because this God knows everything, this God has, the classically theistic God is also omniscient. Omniscient means he knows everything. Omnia in Latin means all things. Scientia in Latin means knowledge. So the Christian God, the classically theistic God, is all-knowing, and he's standing in Aberfan because the Christian God is also omnipresent. A classically theistic God is everywhere, and so the classically theistic God is there in Aberfan because he's omnipresent, and he's just doing nothing. He knows that the avalanche is going to bury these children alive and kill them, some of them not instantly. You or I, if we had that foreknowledge, we would raise the alarm. We would go into all the houses and say, get out of here, a catastrophic avalanche is coming. That's just ordinary human goodness. However, God, he just stands there. And the Christian apologist C.S. Lewis pointed this out. God's black is not our white, because this is a tactic of some apologists. They will say that, well, God looking on while this catastrophe happens and not doing anything, this is good in his way, because his ways are above our ways. But no, C.S. Lewis says God's black is not our white, our black is not his white. What is good for us is good for God. What is bad for us is bad for God. And so, I mean, God's goodness is better than human goodness. It's not the opposite of human goodness. Indeed, if God's goodness was the opposite of human goodness, then we could know nothing about it. This is another tactic of some apologists like Karl Barth, and I've seen Bishop Barron use this as well. They will say that God is wholly other. Bishop Barron will even put it in Latin, totaliter aliter, totally other. However, I point out, like, if this God is totally other, wholly other, then we can know nothing about him. He is like dark matter. Dark matter is also totaliter aliter, wholly other, and we can know nothing about dark matter because it's wholly other. And so, in my view, a wholly other God is indistinguishable from no God. Indeed, I want to do a video. Bishop Barron doesn't realise he's an atheist, but I haven't gotten round to that yet. And so, where were we? So yes, God is standing in Aberfan and he knows that the avalanche is coming. Another attribute of the classically theistic God is all-powerfulness. And so God didn't even have to wake everybody up and evacuate the building. This is what you and I would do, because we are not omnipotent. Omnia in Latin means all, omnis in Latin means all, potens in Latin means strong or powerful. So God is omnipotent, which means all powerful, or the English word almighty will suffice. So the Almighty, he can just push the coal away as it begins to descend down the hill, and it would have been a great miracle, and people would have known for certain that this God exists. Like, imagine a coal avalanche coming towards a school, and then God putting up like a force field and preventing it from coming into the school and nobody gets hurt. Would that not have been a wonderful miracle? An all-powerful God would have been able to do something like that. And yet this God didn't do it. And I would like you to watch, even if you've no interest in monarchy, I would like you to watch at least that episode, Aberfan, because I think it is a plea for people to abandon classical theism, because in that episode, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, he says that the people at the graveside, that there's this iconic scene where all the children's coffins are put in an X, and I think sometimes one coffin is put on top of another because that means that siblings were killed, so one coffin was put on top of the other. Very, very, very sad, but and Prince Philip, he says to Queen Elizabeth, yeah, the people at the graveside there were angry at God. And so, to sum up, I think that in the next 20 years, the penny will drop with the more sophisticated apologists, and they will stop trying to defend classical theism. What will happen is that the likes of, in 20 years, the likes of William Lane Craig will become pantheists, panentheists, cosmotheists, open theists. An open theist is one who says that God does not know the future. So in the next 20 years, I suspect that the sophisticated apologists will stop defending the God of classical theism. John Loftus, PhD, a philosopher who writes for Debunking Christianity, he put it this way: a maximally good being would not have created this world with the creatures in it. Just think of all the suffering, the horrendous suffering that is going on in the world right now. Think of animals suffering, think of children suffering, think of starvation, think of people in chronic pain. No classically theistic God would have created this world and allow carnage like this to continue. And that's what John Loftus tweeted, and I immediately, I says, yeah, this tweet cannot be answered, and I dropped the label deist. I said, no, if there is a God, he is not all good, all powerful, all loving, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. That's another omni attribute of the classically theistic God. He can only will what is good. Bene in Latin means good. Volens in Latin means will. So the classically theistic God can only will what is good. And because he's omnipotent, all-powerful, then his will is effective. So if we have an omnipotent God who only wills what is good, then how come there is so much evil and horrendous suffering in this world? And so, in summing up, I think that in 20 years, the sophisticated apologists will abandon classical theism.